Hi, and welcome everyone. This is the TubeTube coming at you with my League of Legends top lane tier list. A little about me. I've been playing League for 4 years now, and I play mostly jungle and top lane with a little bit of support just for fun. I don't like mid laner or ADC, not my thing, not very good at it. I don't even try. Anyways, I'm currently Diamond 3 right now. Last season I got all the way up to Diamond 2, and yeah, then I got rather tilted and just ended up quitting the game for probably 5-6 months. And I'm starting to get back into it, and this and that. So what I've got for you today, I'm gonna go ahead and do a top lane tier list, and then sort of rationalize my choices. Now this tier list here doesn't have an F tier, but if it's bad, I'll let you know if it's an F tier. So my first champion, Aatrox, I'm gonna put him in the A tier, and here's why. He's got in one ability 3 ways to knock you up, and he also heals for quite a tremendous amount. So if he gets ahead, obviously you're going to have to run away from him, but it's really hard to run away from him when he gets his full combo off. The only reason why he is an S tier is because of the changes they made to his ultimate. His ultimate now gives him like a ton of movement speed, but in order to get the revival aspect of his ultimate, you have to hit your abilities and get either like a kill or assist or something like that. So there is a little bit of skill involved in it now. S tier is usually what I consider, if you're like a diamond top laner and a gold player was to play this champion, they actually have a legitimate shot of beating you in lane just because the champion itself is not balanced and not fair. So yeah, in Aatrox, his W, it's a projectile skill shot, but if it hits you, it slows you for now a very, very large slow, and it's pretty difficult to get out of unless you have like a slow break of some kind. And then it pulls you back in the original spot where you got hit. And then the cone it's very, very massive, so it's hard to sort of get away from Aatrox. His E is a short range dash that I believe also gives him some bonus attack damage, and it also gives him passive spell vamp on his abilities on champions. And then, like I said before, his ultimate just makes him really fast, gives him it's basically a super steroid, and if he gets a killer assist and dies while the ultimate effect is active, he will revive. So overall, I think Aatrox is an extremely difficult champion, especially at high elo, to play against. I honestly feel like there's not too much counterplay, and honestly, he's like an A plus tier. I mean, just like on the verge of going S tier. And the only reason why I think I didn't put him S tier here is if you do manage to, blow your lane or lose lane, or somebody, does just a ton of damage and can get on you immediately and does that damage, you can get bursted and die. Up next, we have a Collie. I'm going to go ahead and put a Collie also in the A tier. Actually, since her nerfs, we'll put her in the B tier. Originally, before they nerfed her way back. I had a serious issue with this champ. I was banning it every game, and for the right reasons, especially due to the champs that I play, just get countered by this. This champion, before the nerfs, had so much sustain in lane, had slows, has a stun on her ultimate, which I still think she shouldn't have, and her shroud made it so she couldn't even be seen by turrets. Yeah, so she would just throw her shroud down and mercilessly beat you underneath your turret, and there was nothing you could do about it. But now I think a Collie, she does do still great damage, and she can be very difficult to go against. But now I feel like there's at least some counterplay. You know, you can, especially since they nerfed the duration of the shroud, I still think she's a very solid pick if you're mechanically solid with the champion. And there's a lot of champions like that, that if you're mechanically solid with the champion, it can be quite oppressive. At high elo, it's very oppressive, but I imagine at the lower elos, a Collie's a bit more manageable for most folks. Alright, let's see who the next top laner is here. Camille. I'm going to put her in the C tier. Camille does add quite a bit to a team just because of her mobility, and her ultimate has quite a bit of utility to it. And her Q does quite a bit of true damage, but the champ has been nerfed quite a bit, and there are some ways to get around her ultimate, but there are certain champions that she does hard counter, and there's not much you can do about it. But overall, I feel Camille is actually in a balanced state, balanced enough state right now. Obviously, I don't typically like the idea of a lot of true damage, and I understand why it's necessary, or else you'd have just tank meta again. I enjoyed that meta just because I like playing tanks, but at the same time, tank meta can be quite boring for most folks. So, and you know, true damage is just hard to balance. But I think she is in just an okay spot. Now, Camille as a jungler used to be disgusting, but as a top laner, I think she's fairly manageable. Next one, Cassiopeia can be played top, but we're just gonna call her a mid laner. Chogath, B tier. Chogath is a tank right now where a lot of his sort of bad matchups have gotten nerfs, even if they are kind of baby nerfs, but especially for a low elo player, Chogath is a really good champion to pick up. He does decent damage. He can get very, very, very tanky in his health bar. Obviously, I'm sure you've seen some videos where his health bar is through the roof, and he's the size of the screen, and it's quite funny. But outside of the memes, he does offer a slow in his kit. He offers a silence, which is 3 seconds, which for casters and even some other champions, it can be pretty brutal to deal against. And a knock-up, which they buffed the cooldown on, so now you can use it a bit more often. And then his ultimate not only gives him bonus HP if you manage to last hit with it, but it does a lot of true damage based on your own max health. If you're a low elo top laner, I definitely recommend you pick up Chogath. And I honestly, I feel like he just doesn't have a whole lot of really tough matchups as long as you just play back. Yeah, Chogath is just a really solid pick. And if you are in the low elos, I would definitely pick up Chogath. Next up is Darius. We're going to go ahead and put him in A tier. Darius is a champion that can 1v5 given the right tools. And the reason why he's so good right now is because he got buffed to where his Q healing was increased by a very, very large margin, so now he can heal for a whole lot more and sustain for a little bit longer in fights, get his stacks off on his hemorrhage, and then get those spicy dunks. Not much more to say about Darius. I feel like Darius right now is a champion. There are certain champions in this game that is just not fun to 1v1 or to face in lane, because the only way to beat them is to have champions with specific mechanics or to have jungle pressure. Darius gets beat by champions like Irelia, or champions with dashes, things like that can get in on him and make sure he doesn't get the healing on his Q. But yeah, I think Darius is a very good champion right now. Not quite in the bullshit tier, but pretty close, and I think he's a solid pick. Still, he's not my favorite blind pick just because he is really heavily countered by CC, and yeah, I mean, good champion. Next up, we're going to go ahead and do Mundo, D tier. This is a shame. I used to really like playing Mundo, and yes, when you get to the very late game, you are pretty tanky with your ultimate because of how much it heals, and if you get ahead early, you can be pretty oppressive in a lane. But the problem with Mundo is they made Mundo out to be the counter to the mage meta that was going along here, that people were complaining about, couldn't beat. So they gave his E a lot of percent magic resistance upgrade, kind of, and then gave him a little bit more damage. But then, a couple patches later, they made Morellonomicon for mages give grievous wounds off of any kind of damage. When it used to be you had to get him below 30% HP for that to happen. And because Mundo takes such a large portion of his current health to start his ultimate, you can really just get destroyed by mages still, who you're supposed to counter. I'm not saying Mundo is completely useless, but there's just so many better picks. And Mundo is a safe pick because you can farm with your cleaver and stuff, but outside of reaching level 16 and being in the very, very end game, which still might not matter because the enemy team might have a Vayne, and Vayne basically makes you worthless. There's just a lot of problems with Mundo right now that Riot doesn't quite know how to deal with yet, and I hope they kind of figure it out soon, because I do like me some Mundo. Next up, Galio's not really played in the top lane anymore. Gangplank, I'm gonna put him in the B tier. This champion, way back when they first reworked him, used to be one of the best champions in the game, just because of how much gold he earned, how much damage he did. They've since nerfed it kind of hard, but his barrels do still slow for quite a bit. He still has a QSS and a heal built into his kit. His Q can get you a lot of gold. It can get you, especially if you're running Klepto, you can get gold for days, and his ult is across the map, but if you don't hit your barrels, you're pretty much just worthless. There's not much more to say. He has to be in a sort of underpowered state just because of how useful his kit is as a whole. And really good Gangplanks can be pretty oppressive to play against, but in my opinion, unless you've got a lot of crit, the damage just doesn't feel like it's there. but that's just me. Like I said, this is my own personal tier list, and I just think Gangplank is kind of middle of the road. You know, not a bad pick, but not really a great pick anymore. Fiora. Now, I hate this champion, guys. I really do. And I was really glad when they nerfed it to the ground, and every time they try and buff it, it upsets me. But Fiora is a champion that does a lot of true damage, but there is a skill cap to it, and now that I've, played more and actively pursued, increasing my skill and just trying to be a better player, it is quite easy to counter Fiora, especially as a jungler. Rammus is a great pick into Fiora because you can Q in, literally just wait for her to press W because she's going to, because of your taunt, and then you just taunt right after, and you'll typically have Thornmail and Grievous Wounds and all that, and she'll just kind of get melted. So Fiora, not in a good spot, and I'm not sad about it in the slightest. Now, coming up next is my personal favorite champion, Garen. I hate to put him here, I really do, because he's my main. I love him to death. But there's just so many things that Garen struggles against, and Garen is really good, I'd say, in sort of the mid-game. His ult is a powerful tool, and when someone is a villain, you can give him the hands. Granted, you also have, Ignite and things like that, but and I do like the changes they made to W, but this is a champion that loses lane hard pretty much against anything ranged, and even a lot of melee matchups. He gets kind of bodied by Darius unless you have some health or help or play it fairly well, which is a shame because, like I said, this is my favorite champion. And if you're low elo, I do suggest you pick up some Garen, because he is he's about as simplistic as you can get in the game, and he's one of my favorites. And for the love of God, guys, stop running Grasp of the Undying on Garen and start running Phase Rush. It's so much better, I promise. Next, Gnar. I want to put Gnar in the middle of the road tier, simply because anything melee he bodies. He does provide a lot to a team fight, and he does do quite a bit of damage. But there are champions that are fairly decent against Gnar, and once you get him to use his jump's on such a long cooldown. As long as you have some means of getting onto him, you can sort of abuse that. And outside of his ult and his stun, he really just isn't anything special, just middle of the road champion. Heimerdinger is played pretty much anywhere, honestly, which is funny. But I'm going to count him as a mid laner. Same thing, Hecarim is usually just played in the jungle, so I'm going to count him there. Lowy. Actually, right now, yeah, I think she's kind of a tweener here. Lowy's a champion that does do quite a bit of damage, especially if she lands her E's. But if she doesn't land her E's, you can get bodied quite hard, and if the enemy team is smart enough to just not fight in your ultimate, you can pretty much body anyone, or you pretty much get bodied by anyone. Yeah, just a decent champion. I mean, a well-designed champion, in my opinion. A lot of people disagree, but I feel like as long as you just don't fight her when she presses R, run away. But if this champion does get elite on you, it can feel quite oppressive and quite annoying. So on to this next champion, which is going to be our first S tier, is Irelia. Irelia is a champion that they've had trouble balancing for a really long time. This champion does a ton of true damage. with Conqueror and heals for a lot with Conqueror. Basically, Conqueror is the reason why Irelia just is really hard to deal with. She heals up very, very well off of minion waves, which also gives her attack speed. If you're very good with auto-attacking champions, I recommend you pick up Irelia. If you hit your abilities, there's no champ in the game, I feel, that's better than Irelia right now. And that's shown in higher elos, especially with guys like TF Blade, who abuse this champion because it's just so oppressive to trade and fight with it. There is a skill cap to it. There is a skill cap to Irelia. I know a lot of people want me to say that this champ takes no skill at all, but the champ does take skill. It's just, I feel like once you have about 100 games on this champion, there's nothing any top laner can do as long as you don't full monkey yourself. Next top laner, Jax, A tier. Another champion that they've kind of struggled to balance with new changes. What makes this champion so broken is one, Spear Shojin. So you can get more attack speed with Spear Shojin and it resets your abilities. So you have an ability that dodges all incoming auto attacks and then converts it back into damage. And he can also get tanky with his ultimate. So he can build straight damage and just kind of smack you to death. And with Spear Shojin, he can gap close, stun you, beat you, gap close again, stun you, beat you over and over and over. And it's not fun to play against this champion if this champion gets a lead. Next top laner, Jayce, ranged champion, fairly simple, does a lot of damage. Has a good way to get away from people. He has an ability that knocks individuals back, while also an ability that speeds him up. But there is a skill cap to this champion. But I mean, the damage is fairly good on this champion, so I don't think he's a bad champion by any means. But I don't think he's, a severely great champion right now. Let me look here. Let me look. Kayle. Kayle's rework, A tier. They have nerfed this champion. I understand that, but at the same time, if you stop, you look at it, people are starting to build this champion differently, and I was playing a game as Garen. I did get a little bit of jungle pressure, God bless. I had 3 kills to this Kayle, and she had a Klepto. All she did, she just kept on Eing me. Literally, as soon as she hit a level 11, all she had was a Triforce, and she just ran me down and smacked me to absolute death, chased me down through my phase rush, and murdered me. This is a champion that people are figuring out different because the build paths are so various, and you can do so many things with this champion. And this champion just has so much utility, especially with her ultimate, that there's just... this champion, to me, is an A tier. I know a lot of people might put her in, like, B tier, but if you play in high elo, you know what I'm talking about with this champion. And I say high elo sparingly. By high elo, I mean D3 up, which just barely puts me in the cut, by the way, because I'm a scrub. Next top laner... Where are we at? Kenan, range champion, isn't really weak at any point of the game. Actually, I'm going to put him here. This champion isn't really weak at any point in the game, doesn't have a ton of bad matchups, has a lot of utility, a lot of damage. He has a gap closer and a getaway, ranged farming ability. He is a ranged champion, does a lot of damage, and can stun more than one person at once with his ultimate, as well as do just enormous AoE damage. I think Kenan's a great champion, a great pick in the top lane if you need ability power. As long as you're good at farming, this champion will always sort of do his job, and And even if you're not, there's still not a point in the game where I feel like you can ever be completely useless with Kenan, because you can walk in and get a good stun and potentially win the game with Kenan. Next, Cled. I think Cled right now is B tier. He's a champion that benefits fairly well from Conqueror and can heal up. This champion, if he gets does do use your words, does do kind of a surprising amount of damage. You don't necessarily suspect Cled's damage until it just sort of happens to you and you're dead. And this champion can snowball really, really hard. The only thing that I believe doesn't put him in his A tier is his ultimate can sometimes be useless, and it's also kind of buggy at times, and just doesn't feel right at times. But overall, Cled's a really solid champion to pick up and learn. What else we got here? Malphite, purely a situational champion. If they've got all AD, Malphite's an S tier champion. His entire kit is around dealing with AD champions, but if there's any kind of AP at all, you lose a large portion of your damage and your overall usefulness, because you do have to build magic resist. But if you can build straight armor, this champion is an unstoppable force of nature, but purely situational. And I'm starting to speed up just because it has been going on for quite a while. I was taking my time in the beginning, but then I realized that there are 130 champions in League of Legends, so get moving a little, tube. Next, Maokai, D tier. Maokai provides a lot of CC, which is crowd control, and he can get really tanky, but he just doesn't do a whole lot of damage, and especially right now with runes like Conquer and a whole lot more ways to sort of deal with tanks coming up, as well as tank items not necessarily being super awesome right now. He's just not a great champion, and he's not in a great position. I would put him C tier if his ultimate, if the roots that rooted you, if they moved a little faster. But the only way Maokai can, actually use his ultimate is he does have to get in the fight and engage first before he uses it. He can't use it sort of as an engage just because of how slow it moves. D tier. Mordekaiser, this is a champion that would be F tier for me. If you don't know what you're doing, this champ can be really oppressive just because of how much heals and shields he has. But, he's an AP champion that is short-ranged and just doesn't provide a lot. I think his rework is going to be really, really awesome. And I'm glad they're reworking him, because not only is he just boring to play, but he doesn't really have a place in League. There's a reason he's not played a whole lot, because he just doesn't have a place, if that makes sense. Let me look. Keep looking. Nasus. A lot of people are going to be surprised by this. I'm going to put him in the A tier. While he does have some counters early, once he gets some CDR items, I think the thing that makes Nasus so powerful is I feel like his kit's just really overloaded. His Q, especially once you get some CDR, is on like a 1.8 second cooldown, so that's 3 extra damage every 1.8 seconds, not counting the cannons that give you 12. His W Wither, I feel, is just insanely, disgustingly broken. It's a slow that gets stronger the longer it lasts, and it lasts for 5 seconds, slowing up to 90%. and slows attack speed. His E provides magic damage in an area of effect and shreds armor, which makes his Q more effective. And then his ult gives him armor and magic resist that gets better the longer the duration, health, range, and resets his Q cooldown to half. So now that Q cooldown's on a 0.9 second cooldown, and he can just beat you to death with it. And it gives him area of effect magic damage. That's, I think, is max health magic damage. The only way to shut this champion down, if they're even decent, is to just have the better team. If your team is behind at all on this champion, and you're up against this champion, you could be wailing on him, but eventually he's just gonna outscale you. I have trouble fighting Nasus consistently, and if they're good and they control the wave and keep it at their turret, there's just not a whole lot you can do against this champion. Nautilus is starting to make a surprise comeback in the top lane. Provides a lot of CC, does a lot of damage, is fairly simple, but at the same time, there are just better picks. I mean, his early game presence is very great, but past the early game, you're kind of useless if you don't, like, you can hit your Q, you can lock one person down, but, outside of that immediate effect, you're kind of useless. But that's just my opinion. I feel like Nautilus as a support is just a much, much, much better pick. Let me see here. Olaf, B tier right now. There's a lot of Olaf top players in Korea that are popping off fairly regularly, simply because they're abusing the champ's ability to spam large amounts of true damage in the early game and kind of bully people. The thing about this champion, though, is if your team's behind, it can be hard to carry just because of the way his kit works. His kit is simply all in. There's not really disengage in his kit, and if your team can't really back you up, while you can't be CC'd, you can get bursted. And tank builds don't necessarily work on him unless you're in the jungle. But he's just a good, solid pick, I think. Ornn, D tier. Now, don't get me wrong, this champ does do a lot of damage, and then once you get to, I think it's like level 13, you can start upgrading your teammates' items, and you can slowly build advantages because of that. But especially with how the resolve tree works, he's missing out on a lot, and I do mean a lot, of power because of what they did by removing his shield. He can't use shield bash now. He can't really get the bonus shielding from the runes anymore, and while he does get 2 free upgraded items at level, I think it's level 12 or 13, something like that. It's just not enough for this champion, I feel. He does provide quite a bit of crowd control, and like I said, he does do damage, but the tank stats just don't feel like they're there now that he doesn't have that shield. Next, Pantheon. We're gonna put him in the kind of below average tier. This champion, while I think he is a decent pick and can snowball a game and use his ultimate to drop on people and cause quite a bit of havoc, the same can be said the other way. If he falls behind even a little bit, you just become worthless and you can't do anything. But he does counter quite a lot of top laners for a decent portion of the game. But if he's not roaming, then he just falls off. And it's simple as that. Oh, wow, I feel like we've been going on forever. Poppy. I'm going to put Poppy in the B tier. One of the tankier champs in the game. Does a lot of really good damage early. But your ult can really kind of screw your team, I feel. Like it can kind of... while it can do a lot of good for your team, it can also mess up certain wombos and certain aspects, and it can turn the tide of a fight for good or for better. Plus, if you don't get your stun against a wall with your E, you basically kind of just push people to safety at a certain point in the game because you just don't do enough damage. But early in the game, you can bully quite a large portion of the champions in League of Legends in the top lane. Renekton. I almost want to put this champion in the S tier, just because his skill cap isn't incredibly high. I'll put him in the A tier. He is a champion that does have... He kind of has it all. His ult gives him health, AoE damage. His E is dash that can be used as an escape, that can be used twice if you use it correctly. That also gives you armor pen. His W is a stun that can hit for 3 times depending on how you manage your fury, which can be pretty big if you're running press the attack or conqueror. And his Q is a pretty beefy damage that can be used area of effect and also heals you for up to a really large portion depending on how many champions are near you. Great champion. I think more people should not play Renekton because I just don't like to see it. Next champion, Riven, S tier, not even a question. 3 dashes in 1 ability that you can animation cancel to maximize damage, that synergizes with your passive, that every single time you use an ability you do extra damage, that can also knock you up at the end, a W that does damage and stuns you. So there's 2 sort of stuns in 1 champion that does an absurd amount of damage. A E that is another dash that also lets you cancel the animations of your abilities while giving you a shield that scales off of your own attack damage. And an ultimate that gives you, I believe it's more range, more damage, and can be used at the end to deal more damage the lower health a champion is. All in all, the mobility of this champion, the ability to hop walls, in itself makes the champion strong, but when you couple that with Death's Dance, this champion just feels really impossible to kill, and it feels like there's nothing you can do. You can be beating this champion pretty handily one moment, then she gets 2 items and she just can't die, and you just get slowly out-sustained and out-destroyed, and then you die. I just don't feel like this champion is fair or balanced, and I feel like if you go into the practice tool and practice the quick Q cancellations and then using your E to animation cancel for your ultimate, you pretty much have mastered this champion. But that is just my opinion. Rumble, he doesn't have his place in the D tier. I feel like Rumble's a good pick because his ultimate is a very powerful tool that can, slow an entire team and do massive amounts of damage. He can be pretty oppressive to lane against, and I feel like his W, which is his shield, comes up quite a bit more often than it should. Has a lot of slows in his kit and does deal a lot of damage. I feel like Kenan, all in all, is more useful as an AP top laner, but Rumble definitely has a spot. Rise right now, S tier, and that might surprise a lot of you because, you look at his win rate and a lot of people are like, well, he's got one of the lowest win rates in the game, yada, yada, yada. There's a reason why he's played on the professional scene every single game, and that's just because his mobility with phase rush and his ability to continually stack his shield along with Seraph's Embrace, which is just a very, very strong item, and you can't kill the thing, and it runs too fast, and it's got really low cooldowns and really high damage and stuns. I just dread having to go against Rise in any situation, simply because even if I survive lane, even if I don't die, this and that, as soon as he gets 2 items, he's just going to start melting, if not me, my entire team, and then with his team, melt me. I'm not saying there's no counterplay at all, but the window is very small with this champion. Shen, I'm going to put him in the C tier right here. He does do quite a bit of damage in the early stages of the game, and he does have his uses against auto-attacking champions with his small, area of effect immunity to auto-attacks for a couple seconds. His dash is still fairly strong, and his ult is fairly strong, especially since ADCs are the most important figures in League of Legends now. Again. But he just... I don't know how to explain it. I don't know how to explain this one in particular. The other ones I kind of have my reasons, but Shen, I feel like, can body certain champions, especially champions like Garen. But against most of the champions above him, he gets bodied. I mean, if you're looking, discounting Garen, discounting Fiora, granted she sucks with her W, and I mean, he gets bodied by every single one of these champions. So, but he does have his uses. That's why he's here and not here. Singed, B tier. When they changed his W to slow for a lot more, I believe he became a lot more useful. This is a champion with a very unique niche in League of Legends. But I don't think he's that great as a tank. I feel like if you build, if you be kind of sneaky with it and build full AP, you're a whole lot more useful and a lot better in fights. But if you build full AP, then you can get bursted pretty hard. So it's a play style that you have to adapt to and sort of learn. But once you learn it, you're fairly efficient and fairly difficult to deal with at times. What is great about this champion is even if you fall behind in lane, you're never entirely useless, just because your fling is a very, very powerful ability for catching people out and separating people from their team. And now with your slowing for 60%, you can fling somebody and then drop your slow in front of his team, so they're a little slower in coming to help whoever you just flinged. Good champ. Scion, B tier, probably one of the better tanks in the game. but they keep sort of slowly nerfing it over and over and over. Really good Scion players are very, very difficult to deal with, just because they kind of know exactly how tanky they are and things like that. But at low elo, especially using your Q properly, can be difficult for Scion players. If Scion gets a little love, he is B++ tier. I mean, he's just on the verge of being A tier. But tank items, I've kind of mentioned it, just not being the greatest items in the game right now, kind of solidifies his spot in B tier, but he's still a very, very solid and effective tank. Top laners. I guess you can count Swain, but you don't really see him anymore. I see him in the mid lane more, so I'm not going to. Okay. Now I know I'm going to get a lot of question marks about this. Okay. But until they address it in a future patch, Tahm Kench is S tier. And here's why. They buffed his damage on everything and nerfed his damage on his W to try and, I don't know, reduce his utility, but his Q, his cooldown got reduced. It just does a lot of damage. His E is a powerful tool because, you can either use it to heal up or you can use it as a secondary sort of health bar in a fight. And his slow is just so much that it's hard to get away from him. And all they wanted to do was kind of balance him in the support role, but all they did was make him OP in the top role, because instead of just making sort of a timer in which you could eat an ally, sort of how Udyr's E works, where he hits somebody and there's a timer before he can hit and stun them again. Instead of doing that with his Chomp, they just made it so he is really, really slow when he eats someone, rather than being able to take them away and then spit them out. So now they're just playing Tahm in the top lane, and there's nothing that can fight it. The only thing that can fight Tahm in the top lane are these other S tiers, and that's quite honestly the truth. Tahm bodies pretty much anything, which is crazy to say, but he really does. He just bodies everything. Where are we at? Teemo. I'm only not putting him in D tier simply because he does do a lot of damage, and his mushrooms can be quite devastating if he's building full AP. And he can be a hassle for melee top laners, but there is quite a bit of counterplay to Teemo. He's low elo nightmare fuel, and I understand that, but at high elo, unless you're playing a useless champ like Garen, all you have to do is sort of get on him, wait out his blind, and then you can kind of wail on him. Urgot, A tier. I really don't like the changes they made with his W to where now it's a toggle ability that doesn't cost any mana at all. He does an absurd amount of damage and is fairly tanky in lane with his E. I kind of like to describe him as slow Riven, which I don't feel like is a terrible analogy, just slow Riven. Trundle, he's being seen more as a jungler right now, and tanks are slowly starting to come back, and Trundle is a champion that, like Malphite, is very role specific. If there's tanks, he's successful, and he's A tier if tank meta is here. If there's not, he's not good. If you're playing against a team with a lot of tanks, pick Trundle, you press R on them and they aren't tanky, and then you are really, really tanky. But yeah, Trundle, not great. Okay, Vlad, S tier. Vlad is a champion that is not only extremely safe, especially with phase rush, but has 1v9 carry potential, does a lot of damage, heals way too much, and has an ability that basically makes him untargetable for, it feels like, 2 seconds, can use Zhonya's to reset his abilities and do the same thing again. Has a lot of mobility with Phase Rush and, what is that rune called? Anyways, you use your ultimate and it speeds you up. Nimbus Cloak, there we go. If you play against Vlad and high elo, it's basically like cutting your hands off and bashing your head on solid concrete because you just can't fight this champion. Tryndamere. Tryndamere is a champion that I'm going to put in B tier. He does do a lot of damage, and if the Tryndamere player is good, there's pretty much not a champion that you can say just hard counters him and shoves him out of the lane as long as the Tryndamere is good. But the thing I don't like about Tryndamere is he basically makes you as a top laner have to stay top because of how he split pushes, and no one quite like Tryndamere can just make a game different in a bad way because you have to always just address him, and even when you do address him, there's a chance he just escapes because he has a 7-second ability where he doesn't die. So it always takes two to three people, especially if he gets ahead, because you can't 1v1 him. So he's just going to take the tower in front of your eyes and then heal up any kind of damage you did to him with the lifesteal that he builds or his Q heal. There's no champion in the game that does what Tryndamere does quite like what Tryndamere does, and it all feels like what he does is all just negative, and it just doesn't feel good. So personally, I despise when I see this champion, and that's just because I know that I'm not going to be able to play the game. That's how I feel personally. Who do we have next? This used to be broken. I'm so glad that it's not a thing anymore. You do see Volibear on the top sometimes, but I'm going to count him as a jungler. Wukong. We're going to go D tier. He is a champion that builds all damage, but as long as you don't play like an absolute animal in lane, you can't really die to him. And even if he brings it Ignite, as long as you survive till like level 6, farm up efficiently, and stay on the same sort of level he is, he really does have to roam and get assistance to get ahead, just because he doesn't do enough. And I'm glad that they are going to rework him and readjust him to be a better champion. Yasuo, he's more played in the mid lane, but I'm going to put him as an A tier just because he does body quite a few top laners. He does struggle against some of these top laners, but for the most part, anything underneath him, he just does insanely well against, and unless you get jungle pressure, there's not a whole lot you can do, because of how mobile this champion is, how he can constantly get his passive shield by being mobile, and the way he scales with crit and all that is kind of difficult to deal with. We're nearing the end of the video here finally as I'm looking, and we're going to put Yorick here in B tier. Yorick is a champion that can be quite difficult to deal with in a similar way that Tryndamere is. If you play tanks that aren't good against sustain, you get bodied by this champion. But actually, you know what? I changed my mind. I'm going to put him in A tier. When he, brings Conquer, especially now, if his Maiden, which is his ultimate, if that is not dead or not on cooldown, you cannot fight this champion by yourself unless he's really, really behind. And even when this champion does get behind, he just split pushes and gets turrets and gets fed, and then fights weaker individuals that go to stop him gets fed off of that. So you can win lane against this champion and still lose just because of the way his kit works and how strong his ultimate is. But with that being said, that's my top lane tier list. It looks kind of pretty, doesn't it? But once again, this is all based on my own opinion. There are champions left on the list that you do sometimes see in the top lane, but you just very, very rarely ever see it in the top lane. Examples of these are like Rengar and Volibear and Gragas, I guess, maybe a little Galio, but they are mained particularly in a different role. So with sort of the mainstream champions that are identified as top laners, this is what I think about them. If you liked my list, thank you. I appreciated that. By the way, I hope I relaxed you enough to catch some sleep. I don't know if you could tell, but I was kind of putting myself to sleep. And I am quite tired. If you have any opinions on your own of where certain champions should be or disagree with me, leave it in the comments, and I'll enjoy reading them and all that good stuff. So I hope you have a great night. I hope you are nice and relaxed, and I'll see you in the next installment of the Tube ASMR.